Weyland Burton. This is my military story. I was in the U.S. Air Force during the height of the Vietnam conflict. However, if you're expecting a lot of drama from my story, you might be disappointed. I will try to condense my Air Force career into this interview. I'd like to start with the anxiety, or first the reason behind my enlisting in the U.S. Air Force. As I said, this was at the height of the Vietnam conflict, and the options for most people, since we still had the draft, was you either get drafted into the U.S. Army, or you might join the Navy, or typically the Navy or the Air Force. A friend of mine and myself decided that we would go in on the buddy system into the Air Force, which turned out to be quite a hoax, really, because we didn't lay eyes on each other. The only thing in common was we were at Lackland Air Force Base for basic training during the same time, but we never saw each other. Getting back to the beginning, my route to Lackland Air Force Base involved me going to Nashville, Tennessee, taking a flight which I had never flown in an airplane, from there to San Antonio. As I said, the anxiety of just being in a plane was pretty interesting, I'll put it that way. Turned out to be rather uneventful. Made my flight to Lackland. The usual, for those who've been in the military, you realize that there's a lot of things unique to basic training in the military, but the situation was such that at this time 8 weeks of basic training would be the normal Air Force time, but we had condensed it to 6 weeks to get people online earlier. It actually increased the stress level of all facets of basic training, including the physical aspects. They were very big on getting you physically ready for military service. I was very fortunate in the sense that I was in great physical condition because I had played football and other sports in high school, and that served me very well. I guess even the discipline aspect of sports served me well. There were a number of interesting things about basic training, and this would be perhaps stuff that other people wouldn't remember, but you had various responsibilities when you were in basic training, and I remember that the perhaps worst duty that one could have was latrine queen. That simply meant being in charge of the restroom area. And the guy who earned this honor, his name is most interesting, Andrew. And our TI was a very tough guy, as they demanded all TIs to be, but ours seemed to have special recognition. I was lucky enough to get one of the really tough TIs. He referred to this guy as, first of all, the latrine queen, but secondly, he called him Alphabet. He didn't want to refer to him by name each time, so he just said Alphabet. And another thing that I remember was the difficulty that most of us had in learning to make our bunks to satisfaction of the TI, actually. You really had to work hard to get your bunk properly made, and another thing was the time factor. To get your shaving done and your bathroom activities, your showering and so forth, you had a very short amount of time, and it was like chaos. Not even organized chaos. It was pretty chaotic, especially at the beginning. As time goes along, you learn to manage your time, and it becomes a little easier, though I never found it to be particularly easy. One incident that occurred that shall always be with me is when we were ready to graduate almost. We were in the physical aspect of it, and two things actually about that. One thing involving me personally, and the other thing was a lesson that I learned about people helping people. But me personally, our TI, you had different people in charge of different areas of the thing. Our physical trainer was called Superman for a reason. He was really well. He was in great shape, and he expected people to be able to complete the training. You got marks, of course, and if you didn't make the marks, you had to stay over for another 6 weeks. And I recall one time after we did 25 push-ups, after some other physical activities, it was very challenging for most people, but as I said, at that time I was in very good shape, so I could pop out 25 push-ups with little sweat. And he pointed at me. He didn't know people by name, didn't care, but he said I was grinning and ordered me to do 25 more push-ups. So that's a little challenging for most people, and it was challenging for me, so I was able to do it. And I recall that he didn't pick on me in the future because that showed him or convinced him that I was okay in that. Another thing that really I hope stays with me for the rest of my life is we had a guy who had fallen back. I've forgotten the exact words that we used when someone failed in their 6 weeks of training. But this young man had, you could look at the boy and tell that he had never had any physical activities to speak of, and he had already gone through this one time and perhaps even twice. I'm not sure how many times he had failed his physical aspects, but he had to stay and work 6 more weeks each time. Everybody in our flight was aware of this, and on the running aspect, I don't recall just how far we ran, but we were limited in time to reach that. So people were literally running circles around him, but he had to hang in there and run the same distance. And I had gotten my time, and frankly, I wasn't that worried about the situation until I saw 2 guys go up on either side of him and lend their support to keep him from falling from exhaustion. And they tried to get him through on the allotted time, and I think they actually did, just to make this a good story. But anyway, the point with me was not whether or not he made it, but was their attitude in helping him to get across the finish line. That sticks with me to this day. Another aspect that my grandson Grant was very interested in was the marksmanship. I got expert marksman, and I think one of the real reasons for this was when I was growing up, I had access to guns, and hunting was a love of mine, and we tried not to waste ammunition. So we always tried to hit the target the first time, and I got the expert marksman badge, which I was fairly proud of, but it means to me, it means more to me now, I suppose, than it did then. Just crossed my mind about a young man from Buffalo, New York. I remember his not being familiar with weapons at all, and when we were on the firing range, the TI came by and engaged this young man in conversation, and he turned around and his gun was pointed right at the TI, which it angered him very much. And we had some choice words flying through the air that was pretty embarrassing, but he got set back on his flight, So he had 6 more weeks just because of losing his train of thought and letting that gun point toward the TI with live ammunition. So it could have been bad. As little as he knew about weapons, certainly he would be the last one I'd want pointing the gun at close distance to me. But there were other episodes in basic training that were interesting. Some aspects you may not realize. You have to go back to the late 60s now. I was in from January of 67 until, March of 67 to January of 71. So the main communication was writing of letters. And it was extremely important when mail call came. And we all stood around while the TI read the names of people getting mail. I was blessed to have a wonderful wife, as a matter of fact I still am, who wrote me as often as she could, and I think that was like every day, though we didn't receive them every day. But it was so encouraging to hear from her, since our first son had been born at that time, and I was learning about his development through letters. Okay, enough I think for the basic training aspect. I graduated and my orders sent me to Biloxi, Mississippi in a career field which was, for those who know me, they may laugh on this, it was intelligence. And you had to have a top secret clearance in this field. What we did was I was in radio intercept actually, and you intercepted messages from the enemy, which was Russia at that time, and then there were decoders. You really didn't know what you were intercepting, but the decoders could determine what was being sent as messages. The future was that you would be sent to a very remote site somewhere around the world, usually somewhere around Russia, and you would sit for many hours with a headset on, hearing messages. I had already achieved the passing grade, the minimum passing grade, when the episode that really changed my military career occurred. I had a hearing problem and didn't go to the medical people right off, and probably should have right off, but I tried to put it off, and wax had built up on the inside and was about to rupture my eardrums, and they did an emergency type surgery on me at Biloxi Air Force Hospital, and they were pretty convinced that I was going to be at least hearing deficient, if not even deaf, which wasn't a good encouraging forecast for me. So they changed my AFSC to recreation services. Very soft, you would think. No position, I guess, in the Air Force at that time was just terribly comfortable, but I had my duties. I'll jump ahead to where I went from there. They sent me to Strategic Air Command, headquarters of the 8th Air Force, which was Westover Air Force Base in Massachusetts. The transition was quite profound. A country boy from Alabama and his wife moving to Massachusetts. And I could say much about the transition, but I'll try to stick to the military aspect. While at Westover, I served in such interesting positions as woodshop director. I ran the base gymnasium and actually gave a lot of 5BX, which was the physical program for the pilots and higher ranking officers. I did not wear a traditional uniform. Many officers addressed me, even high ranking officers, as sir, because they wanted to pass their 5BX program. There were even occasions where I was offered special stuff, Air Force stuff. Even people I know traded for basketballs and for toilet tissue and other such things from base supply in order to give people passing grades, which I think it only reasonable that I would stick to the books and not accept bribes, and I did so. I'm very happy that I did that. As time went along, I was given a TDY assignment to Guam, 180 days, 6 months. This was the base that was so involved in the B-52 flights over Vietnam doing the heavy bombing. All of those bombing flights originated in Guam, and I could tell so many stories of things that happened in Guam. Just to touch on the kind of thing, another buddy from Mississippi and I would crawl under the fence in an area where the rainfall had led to a wash, and you could get under there. We would go into what is called boonies. There's a lot of leftover military stuff from the World War II, and we were interested in such things, and also we were interested in wildlife. Iguana lizards were real common, and we were kind of half afraid and half excited by the sight of iguana lizards. We carried pistols, but really never used them. Also, I might add that it was pretty well known that there were 3 soldiers left from World War II, 3 Japanese soldiers who never surrendered, and were hiding in the boonies or the woods around Guam. And there was that hair-raising suspense of perhaps running into one of them. We did not, but it was interesting for us. Another thing was the trip to the beach, which was a highlight for all of the airmen. The beach that we were allowed to go to was separated by some 18 miles, if I remember correctly, from the point on the base where you caught the bus. So it was a big bus ride down to the beach and then a big bus ride back. That was our recreation when we could go to the beach. When I was going there, not when I was, yes, I think it was when we were deployed, we were to land in Okinawa. This is probably as close to war-related stuff as I was actually in. We were told that the landing gear of our plane would not deploy, and so we circled the Okinawa airport for a while as they, I guess, worked on it, and it became known to us that we were headed into a very risky situation. And some of the people who were loudest, I remember, got extremely frightened. I noticed that some Catholic airmen were crossing themselves, and it was very, very quiet and serious. The end of the story is great. They had all of the emergency equipment out on the runway, but it turned out to be a typical landing. Our landing gear did deploy, and there was nothing in the way of life-threatening stuff as it turned out. But I just added that for suspense. Another thing that I might mention about being on Guam was we had a very severe typhoon. They evacuated most of the personnel from the Air Force Base. I was one of those left behind, and I got to see the ravages of a typhoon. Metal roofing would actually fly through the air in such a manner that if one was out in it, it would have cut you probably into half. Certainly it would have been very bad. Excuse me. And then when the eye went over, it got so deathly quiet. I remember taking a trip to the dining hall during the passing of the eye from my barracks. Another little thing I'll mention about being deployed to Guam, was this was a bit challenging. There were 6 of us in a very small room. We had 3 bunks, upper and lower, and mine was by the door. I slept on the top bunk at the door, and there were some activities that were taking place. I think people just wanted to have something to do sometimes, but it had happened a few times that people on that particular bunk were smashed with a baseball bat or something of that nature when they came in the room. This was our own people now. This was not the enemy. But I was always a little nervous and learned to wake up at the opening of the door. Okay, so much for that. A sad part of the Vietnam era took place when we arrived back in the U.S. We flew into, I want to say too that going out there, we went to Alaska first, and we were in our summer not fatigues, but 1505s, and it was very cold in Alaska. We had to stand outside the plane while it refueled, and that was memorable for that reason. Dwight and I got to go back to Anchorage, where I had landed. We got to go back a few years ago, and it was so different. For one thing, it wasn't military; it was civilian then, so it was different. Getting back to the disappointment of returning back to the States, many U.S. citizens were very upset with our involvement in the Vietnam War, and they seemed to take it out on the military people. So while we were on the buses and so forth, there was some profanity and things that really disappointed those of us who had given 6 months to be in a place that we didn't want to be in. Some were risking their lives for sure, but that's just the way it was. And anyway, to get up to speed again, after we got back, my wife and son, we reunited, and it was a very difficult thing to get to renew my acquaintance with our, well, less than 6 months old, I believe, son. He was afraid of me because he thought of Daddy as being the picture that his mom had showed him all the time. So he was very afraid, and we had quite the drive to Massachusetts from Alabama for me to get reacquainted with him. It took longer than that for us to get a father-son relationship. Later on, when I was about to be discharged, there was much excitement with everyone because there was a 60-day early out that was being offered for some people, and you didn't know for sure if you would be in that 60-day early out or if you'd have to stay the extra 60 days, which would seem like an eternity when you so look forward to that. As it turned out, I did get the 60-day early out, so where I went into service in March, I got out in January. It was 4 years less 2 months. Summarization of my military time, I'm so happy looking back that I had the career I did, and the ways that it benefited me were so innumerable. I wouldn't even attempt to try to cover all of them at this point, but it was a wonderful experience, and I wouldn't take anything for it. One thing of note, since I have gotten out, it was almost something that people seem to be tempted to be ashamed of, to have served during Vietnam. And I didn't give a lot of thought to it until 2 years ago, almost to the day, I was stricken with cancer. And once I was stricken with cancer, it became very big in my life to look back on having served in Vietnam. I now have three caps which say Vietnam Veteran, and I wear those caps proudly, and I wear them often. And I just feel like that it has put into me a deep reverence for our nation and its standing for the values that we do. I knew that I would leave out several things that I wanted to add, but if I could go back to the beginning, even before I was actually, no, just after I enlisted, I had this top secret clearance, which was not easy to get in those days, and the FBI went to my hometown and started quizzing neighbors and friends, and the word got out that I must be in some sort of trouble because the FBI was checking me out. But that's the measures that they went to get a top secret clearance. And again, back to where I was about looking back on the military service, I was so proud to have received a top secret clearance. And there was much that went with that affected me just like it did other people with top secret. As I said in the beginning, no heroism. I did see many heroes. I never considered myself to be one, but I did consider myself blessed to have known many heroes. And I would suggest that this is a snapshot of almost 4 years of my life, which I shall cherish to my dying day. And I hope anyone seeing this might have a little better insight into me and why I am who I am today, and how much the military had to do with that. Thank you.